when we start to get into some of these details, what you certainly need to pay attention to is what's happening to the geometry of details. So if you're drawing like a display, or you're drawing a parting line, or you're drawing a hinge, a knob, something like that, what you need to think about is not just there's a knob on this surface, there's some kind of geometry that's taking place around that knob. And so I'm going to draw just a simple knob to begin with. And before I actually draw it, I just want to draw like a section view of really what we would see on that knob. So I'm going to draw one that's going to be somewhat flush, but come out. And so if we look at what the section view of this drawing would be, and this isn't like the details on the inside of this knob wouldn't necessarily be important, but again, I just want to show you kind of what's happening with the geometry. So, again, somewhat simple section view. Of, let's just say this is the knob on a heater that you turn clockwise to turn the heat up and counterclockwise to turn the heat down. But when we look at this, if we look at these details in here, again for this section view, there's probably a small radius. Very few manufactured products, well, I take that back, more and more increasingly equipment allows for us to do this. There's more machining that takes place in certain products, but right in here and right here, you're typically going to have some type of radius, and that's because to get accuracy and tolerance and products in and out of tools when you mold them, having details like that make it simpler and easier to manufacture. And so if we're looking at just what that knob might be, and I'm just going to draw a simple orthographic view of this knob that I'm talking about. There's basically going to be a small gap in there. I'm just going to draw the surface. Let's put in kind of an interesting bevel detail across this thing. And notice I am actually going to use tools for this exercise. And I'm really just going to be thinking about what's happening. Even though the radius is so small on this knob, I probably would not draw it the way that we talked about during summer op, which is to put a line to represent the beginning and the end of that fillet or that radius. I am going to represent it when I start to render. So I'm going to create a layer underneath this one. I'm going to put a base color for maybe the main housing. So I'm just going to fill this with a color. And now I'm going to add a base color for the knob itself. And you know what, let's just go with a simple gray. Here's a situation where I probably can use my eraser and a circle template to mask this thing after the fact. And to begin with, I'm going to lock the transparency just to throw kind of the dome effect across this surface. Go to my airbrush, make it pretty big, and just add some contour to this knob. kind of got a little bit of a dome effect to it. Most of this stuff should be review. Now I'm going to look at these just recessed areas within the handle. And you know what? I'm going to redraw those. On top so that I can lock transparency and get a nice airflow material across this surface. So I'm going to lock the transparency on that. Go back to the airbrush. Do the opposite for this interior surface that I did for the exterior so that I can tell what kind of contour is happening across the surface. But what we're talking about today is adding detail and looking at where maybe some highlights would show up. I can see that there's something I don't necessarily like across here, so I'm going to begin to clean this up. Now the places I'm going to see these details the most are going to be on the edge of the knob. And what do I do with this negative space in here? And it's going to be on the inside edge of this out here. And so we're just going to look at different ways to handle this. I'm going to add a layer on top. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a highlight with this. And I'm going to go to the paintbrush, but I'm going to make this paintbrush fairly small. And I'm actually going to change and work with the opacity after I put this highlight on here. But what I'm looking at, if we go back to this original drawing, is that corner radius right there. How can I handle that? How can I make this thing pop and look a little bit more realistic? And so I'm going to go back to this. And remember, one of the things to keep in mind is that you can always use, if you're using a Cintiq upstairs or you're using a tablet, you can always use the same drawing tools that you used in SummerOp when we were doing this stuff by hand. It's just you're actually placing it on top of the surface. And so I've got white, and I'm pulling, if you notice, I'm pulling this this circle just inside the original line work that I created. And I'm basically going to throw a highlight on top of it. And then on the opposite side, and this is probably on the opposite side, I'm going to throw a little shadow over here. And then I'm just going to play with the opacity and knock that down just a little bit. And I can use, and this was a tool that I heard you guys say you really liked, I can use this soft eraser and come in and begin to get rid of some of the area right in here where it switches over. And so that's just adding a little bit more depth to this. And then in a couple of places, if I turn this back on, again, I've knocked the opacity down. Now I can use that paintbrush or a pencil to even add a little bit, a little bit starker highlight across that surface. And so actually in the negative space, we're going to drop in a pretty significant dark black area. And with this, I'm even going to use the tool. And this black will, if I get it to the right size, will help me clean up some of the details around there. And so that's where I've basically got some negative space. And then the last thing that I want to do is almost the opposite of what we did just a moment ago with the highlight and the shadow on. Let's do this with the airbrush. Let's see which one works better. Maybe I won't have to use the soft eraser here. And just kind of have it fade out as it moves in one direction or the other. I guess I can still knock that opacity down. And so what that's showing is it's beginning to show, again, if we look at this section view, it's beginning to show this area right here as it goes into shadow, and that area as it hits a highlight. And I can do that really moving around this object, but that's the place where we really want to focus on it, and we'll do another detail in just a minute. But when I look at this now, I think I can do some other stuff just with where the knob and the place, the touch point of that knob. Or I can drop a little shadow across right there. And I can drop a small highlight right here. And even put a little bit bigger highlight here, and I can throw another one up here, again assuming if I've got a light source over my left shoulder. You could put one right in here, another highlight, but that's pretty white already. So again, this is just looking at details. So that's a fairly simple one. Now let's look at maybe if we had some kind of digital display. So I'm going back to the pencil. This is going to be another fairly simple display. What I'm going to do here is put like a background gray color. And again, you can use the fill bucket if you'd like, if it works. I guess I've got some spacing issues in here. Let me come back to this. But I think some of those fill options leave something to be desired with a small white space down here, which you probably can't see from where you're sitting. So I'm still going to fill this the way that I normally do. It'll be fairly easy to erase the unwanted stuff. Oh, and in fact, I don't even need to erase that because I'm going to put a base color here. Oh, and one other thing. So I'm going to grab this layer, I'm going to duplicate that layer, I'm going to come in here to my selection tool, and I'm actually going to scale this up. so that I have that gap that we talked about just a moment ago. And in fact, I'm going to scale this up.
Would it not be a better idea to use the selection tool, the polygon selection tool, to run along, because you can do the straight lines running along the edges and then lock transparency.
Oh, for this back screen?
If you were just trying to color within a certain area.
Sure, we'll try that in just a second. So let's, or I'm going to erase doing that. Let's try this. Let's give it a very similar color to what we were doing a little bit earlier. This is going to be my background. Let me think for a second. So you're suggesting that maybe, whoops, we come in here. And I can actually make a selection like this. And just fill in like so. Yeah, you can do that. And then I can just come in and get these radiuses. And clean up anything that I don't want. So yeah, you can certainly do that. I guess we could even do that for, well, I'm going to do that later. So on this, well, I'm going to wait for that. No. On this, I'm going to lock transparency. I'm going to pretend like this is a large curved surface. I'm going to go to white. Add a little bit of a highlight there. And a little bit of a shadow over on this side. And I'll show you what we'll do in a minute. So like I said, we're going to do just a simple display here. So I'm going to go up to my text tool. And type in display. And I actually found an interesting font. That begins to look like an LCD display. And you can rasterize that layer just like in Photoshop, so now it's seen as something else. But now what I want to do is I actually want to throw a clear transparent surface over top of that. So I'm just going to go to black. We'll do this as a frosted surface. And we'll knock the opacity down. And we're actually going to play with this even a little bit more in just a moment. I'm going to erase. And I guess again you could use a selection tool to erase some of this stuff. I just find it easy. To do it somewhat of an old-fashioned way. So you can see where I've got that display now. And the thing that I want to do, let's just assume that the orange, which is maybe the plastic housing, isn't quite as glossy as the display is. And so what I want to do on top of this is I'm going to add another layer. And this is very similar to what we did the other day with that knife. But I want to show a little bit more of a glossy surface. And so I'm throwing in a little bit starker highlight running across this. And again, you can play with the transparency of what's going on. And here you really want to make sure that you get rid of everything that you don't want. So again, it's only showing up across that cover surface. And the nice thing is you can continue to play around with the transparency, or excuse me, the opacity, to kind of get it where you want it. And then the last thing that I want to do is basically the same thing that we were looking at with that knob, and it's to add a little bit more highlight and shadow based upon the radius that runs around this object. So I've got white. I've started a new layer. I'm just going to come to my ruler and run a highlight across the top. Hit a hot spot right there. I'm going to do the opposite and put a shadow below, which I can do that on the same layer. And the degree to which you do this, you could actually add some over here to the side if you wanted. Let's do that. I'm going to knock the opacity down on this, so for that reason I'm actually going to start a new layer. And then do the same thing to the plastic housing. So I'll pick up a highlight here. Across that surface. And a small shadow there, which that's a little too far away. And the size of these highlights and shadows are really just going to depend on how big that radius is. And again, you might pick up a hot spot over here in the corner. This font is called Renegade Master. That's I'm pretty sure I never thought I would say that out loud in class. You can go to 1001 free fonts, and they have different categories. I think one of them is digital or LED, and this was under that LED. And I guess there is one other thing that you could add. You could add like a little bit of, let me find, I'm going to add a layer on top of that display, because right now that display doesn't really seem like it's, and you can do a little bit more in Photoshop if you went into this, and you could give it like an outer glow, and it actually glows a little bit. If you stay in Sketchbook, I'm going to go to that same color and grab the airbrush, pump that airbrush up, and I'm just going to go on a layer above this one and just kind of run a small glow just around that. It doesn't feel very illuminated, but the darker that I make maybe the background, the more illuminated that's probably going to be. So let me actually do that. Let me just go in and make this a black and see if it helps pop. So I lock transparency, and that does to some degree help that thing pop just a little bit. And in fact, since all that's black, the highlights are the only thing that are making the difference. Yeah, I did that below it. The difference that show where that plastic part stops and where it ends. Okay, are there any questions?
If you wanted to use some of the features in Photoshop, and you're going back and forth, how well do the two programs play together?
Let's try it. Let's